Great. Welcome everyone to House Healthcare Committee on Friday, February 3rd. Hopefully everyone's staying warm. So for the next half an hour or so, we're going to talk with Wilda White, who is the founder of MadFreedom. And since we have many new members, I'm going to start with just quick introductions of us, and then we'll turn it over to you. And I believe she's going to share her screen, but there's also a presentation on our committee page. So Alan, excuse me. Do you want to
Alan Meyer, representing Enosburg and Montgomery.
Gina Burlington.
Alyssa Black, Essex.
Lori Houghton, City of Essex Junction.
And I'm Topham McFawn. I live in Barrytown, represent Barrytown and a part of Williamstown.
Murray Curtis, Lincoln, Bristol, Moncton, and Starksboro.
Daisy Rebecca, representing the beautiful city of Winooski.
Leslie Goldman, Wyndham 3, Rockingham, Westminster, and Brookline, which is the Bells Falls area.
And Art Peterson, as we just spoke, Clarendon, Wallingford, West Rutland, and part of Rutland Town.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to you, Wilda.
Meet you all. Thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Wilda White. And as the chair said, I am the founder of an organization called MadFreedom, which you are going to hear an overview of today. I am going to share my screen just because it might facilitate our conversation. I make it more efficient. Is the screen?
Yes. Perfect. I love the colors too. Orange is my favorite color.
Thank you. Yeah, that's our tagline. None of us is free until all of us are free. MadFreedom is a nonprofit 501c4, not a 501c3, human and civil rights advocacy organization based in Pulteney, Vermont, founded in 2020 by me. And we're funded by donations, none of which are tax deductible as charitable contributions, because a 501c4 is allowed to participate in the political process, as long as that's not our
Interesting.
I wasn't not sure.
function.
Thank you.
We're allowed to lobby, we're allowed to endorse candidates, we're allowed to contribute. And our mission is to secure power and influence, to end the discrimination against people based on their perceived mental state. And I wanted MadFreedom to be an organization that wasn't a single issue organization, because we are all more than one thing. We are just who we are. And I wanted to have an organization where we were striving to make the world a better place for everybody. And that's what's reflected in our vision. Why MadFreedom? I think to understand why MadFreedom, you need to understand a little bit about me. I wanted to be a lawyer since I was 8 years old, and focused my whole life on doing that, and actually did achieve that. And then became a lawyer and became a managing attorney in my law firm, and decided that I wanted to go to business school. Because I was fascinated by business. And so I ended up going to business school, and my career became a little bit more varied. I started running companies. I did some management consulting. And then when I was in my late 50s, I went to a doctor who prescribed some medication that triggered a psychotic manic episode, which he failed to diagnose and treat. And so the episode was long and protracted. And I ended up homeless, penniless, jobless, and friendless. And so those 2 years I spent being homeless, you would think would be the hardest part of that episode. But what really was the hardest part of it was not being able to secure employment based on my psychiatric history afterwards. Despite everything I had accomplished in my life, no one would hire me. And I actually returned to Vermont. I'm a graduate of UVM, and I had been living in California for most of my career. I returned to Vermont and took a job at Vermont Psychiatric Survivors, because I decided, well, I need to find a job where having a psychiatric history is one of the qualifications. And so that was that job. And so I returned to Vermont to do that job. And I did that job for 3 years, but it wasn't, my life's work. It wasn't my passion. And so I quit that job, saying to myself, well, I'm not being paid very much. And with my credentials, if I can't figure out how to make $60,000 some other way and be happy, There's something wrong with me. But it was very difficult. I couldn't find another job to make 60,000. What I ended up doing was working 3 jobs, doing farming during the day, being a night security guard, and doing transcription. Which is all to say that it's really important to me to fight against this discrimination and oppression based on one's psychiatric history. And so that's kind of the impetus of why I wanted to start an organization that was focused on discrimination. But the impetus was when the former commissioner of Department of Mental Health, Sarah Squirrel, decided that she was going to house psychiatric patients who were COVID positive in the former Woodstock Juvenile Detention Center. And that just got under that just disturbed me in a way that I can't even articulate how disturbing that was. And I tried to negotiate with them. I was like, this is not appropriate. People who have COVID, they need access to ventilators, they need access to medical doctors. You cannot stick people just because they have a psychiatric diagnosis in a prison. And they were unyielding until I said that if they did it, I was going to go into court and sue and get a temporary restraining order. And it was only at that point where they decided they had another alternative. And so the combination of my passion for fighting for justice and this impetus made me found MadFreedom, and to focus on the discrimination and the oppression. And the way we, I think that was a little premature. The way MadFreedom sees its role is really to understand the influence of cultural politics on this oppression and discrimination. And when I say cultural politics, I'm talking about the way people's attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and perceptions, the media, and the arts all come together to create certain political and legal and social realities that are true for people who have psychiatric history. And I want to just walk you through what some of those realities are. Here's our president, our former president.
We're going to have a president that goes out of his way to insult anybody who doesn't support him or threaten them with jail. That's not normal presidential behavior. We wouldn't tolerate it from a high school principal. We wouldn't tolerate it from a coach. We wouldn't tolerate it from a coworker. We wouldn't tolerate it in our own family, except for maybe crazy uncle somewhere, Yeah,
And so, that's the reality of what it is on a daily basis, having America's leaders disparage people like that without any critique or protest from anyone. And I'm also a prolific reader of newspapers, and among them is America's newspaper, the New York Times. And these are the kinds of headlines that I have to read. Is Mr. Trump nuts? And the kind of New York Times in this editorial writes, is Mr. Trump mentally fit to be president of the United States? It's an understandable question. It's understandable because Mr. Trump's behavior in office, impulsive, erratic, dishonest, childish, and crude. These are all the characteristics that the New York Times is saying are characteristics of people with mental illness. And this is my daily experience of reading this. Here's an opinion piece by one of their columnists titled, "Who's the Real American Psycho?" And she says, here's the question. Who would you rather have a professional assassin after you or a frothing maniac with a meat cleaver? Again, this is her characterization of people with mental illnesses, and this is coming in America's newspaper of record. And then the word crazy is a universal epithet. You all use it. I've heard it on this committee. This may sound like a crazy question, or we live in a crazy world. Every time we use this language, we are sending the message to people who are labeled with mental illnesses that there is something wrong with being mentally ill, that there's something wrong about them. It's not a psychological state. It's not an illness. there's something bad about them. And you wonder why people don't want to enter the mental health system, right? Who apparently don't want treatment. Well, who would want to say, yes, I have a mental illness when you have to be subjected to this every day on a daily basis? And it's not just, it's all of us. We have Tesla. They actually have a gear in their car called the insane mode. We have Donald Trump calling people crazy and psycho. We have President Obama calling people crazies. This Alcatraz Psycho Ward outpatient t-shirt, you can buy that at any souvenir store in California.
The worst thing to call somebody is crazy, is dismissive. I don't understand this person, so they're crazy. That's bullshit. These people are not crazy. They're strong people. Maybe the environment is a little sick.
You didn't recognize that?
Yeah.
That's just me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Who can remember?
Go back.
That was
You gave me multiple choice. Like,
I know. I
Was it Claire?
just want to tell you who it was.
Dave Chappelle.
Thank you, Dave.
That's not from me. That was from
I
Claire,
didn't know.
Dave Chappelle.
who I don't know who is, so I.
Dave Chappelle is probably the most renowned comedian in the world today.
Oh.
Also very controversial. But at one time in his career, after he turned down a huge chunk of change and left his television show and moved to Africa, was called crazy. And then I just want to, I'm not going to go through these, but, I've already told you about the discrimination I've received in employment. And this is the results of surveys where employers do not want to hire people who have a psychiatric history or psychiatric presence. And Americans don't want to work with people with mental illnesses. We're also scapegoated for gun violence. President Obama, after the October 2015 shooting in Oregon, basically just defines anybody who kills someone as a person with a mental illness. And then you can read what Donald Trump has to say. It's not guns, it's mental illness that pulls the trigger. But the reality is, first of all, people who kill other people is a small minority of the population. And people with mental illnesses who kill other people are also a very small minority of those who have a mental illness. And there's no clear link between killing somebody and a mental illness. In fact, all the research, which you heard, I think it was just yesterday, from Commissioner Hawes, explain what the data that says about the connection between mental illness and violence. And then, additionally, we die 20 to 25 years prematurely, usually from the treatments that we receive. They cause diabetes, they cause tardive dyskinesia, weight gain, kidney failure. We're disproportionately incarcerated. Up to a quarter of people incarcerated are said to have a severe mental illness, although our percentage in the population is much less. 16 times more likely to be killed by police. And most people don't want us even marrying into their families. So that's why MadFreedom, because that's what I feel like needs to change. You'll hear, you probably don't hear, but in my, the people I run with talk all the time about the injustice in the mental health system. We talk about how it's a second-class system, how the offerings of that system are limited to basically meds and beds. We talk about how the coercion in the system, and we talk about the harm from the system. But the problem is not the mental health system. The problem is all the attitudes that we hold, our perceptions that influence how that system operates. And so kind of MadFreedom has like this two-tier thing. We want to work on changing these cultural politics that we think are influencing the injustice in the mental health system. And some of the things that we are doing or are embarking upon are what we call the C-word campaign, raising consciousness about the relationship between stigma and oppression and the normalization of words such as crazy, nuts, insane, and psycho to disparage people. And that campaign is we're developing an app that people are going to be able to download and take the pledge of not to use words crazy to put people down. And if they do, they can put money in a virtual C-word jar and then donate the money to MadFreedom.
That's great.
And so we have an analog jar too. I have people who've already taken the pledge and who deposit the money and donate to MadFreedom when they slip. We also are big proponents of the annual Mad Pride celebration, which is an annual event in July that coincides with Bastille Day. We have 2 members of your committee who were there at the last time. Representative Chena actually walked in the parade. Okay. I think you were there. I don't know if you walked, yes, but you were probably behind me. I was you will see what role I was. I was just loud. And so that event is really important, I think, because people who are labeled with mental illnesses grow up in shame, right? And so what we're trying to do is to say there's nothing to be ashamed about, that the way to actually find your voice and your power is to say who you are. And then the last thing we do, we really try to work on the media, lots of op-eds, lots of guest essays, and lots of conferences. I'm frequently invited to speak and give keynote presentations. Most recently, I was invited to speak at a conference in Berlin, Germany. I have to say Germany because every time I say Berlin, they're like, really? Outside of so I'm not going to play this whole thing, but just to give you a flavor of.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the Disruption Network Lab for taking up this issue of justice and mental health. It's very heartening to even hear those words in the same sentence.
So that's another important part of what we did. And you can find links to all of these resources, and particularly that. And I encourage you to listen to that keynote because the title of the keynote was State Violence and Mental Health. And I use a lot of examples from Vermont in it. Then we also do legislative activism. We've been quite busy in this legislature. And some of the things we've accomplished, we managed to get a person on the Criminal Justice Council, who's a psychiatric survivor. We were also very active in helping write the law enforcement use of force bill. And in particular, we had a provision included in that bill that said that law enforcement needs to take somebody's mental impairment into account in deciding how much force to use. And out of that came a use of force policy that includes a whole appendix about how to interact with people experiencing mental health issues. And I'm happy to say that since that bill was adopted, there have been no people in mental distress killed in the state of Vermont. And in contrast, in the last 10 to 15 years or so, there have been at least 10 people in mental distress killed in the state of Vermont. And those have really been the only killings in the state of Vermont. And so I feel really happy with the way that bill came to be and the way it's operating in practice. We found out that there was a law in Vermont that people with mental conditions or psychiatric disabilities are unable to consent to sex, such that if you had sex with us, you could be accused of rape. And we had that changed 2 years ago. We advocated for basing consent on somebody's individual ability to consent and not based on somebody's status or class. And the last thing we did, I'm not going to go into that just in the interest of time. You can read that on your own. What we're interested in this legislative session is we're interested in ending the coercion in the mental health system. There's a bill that's supposed to come up about warrants for emergency examination, which we hope to play a role in addressing. There's also there's also a law in Vermont that people with so-called severe psychiatric disabilities are unable to get married. In the U.S., severe psychiatric disability includes diagnoses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major clinical depression. This is personal to me because I've been labeled with at least 2 of the 3 of those diagnoses. And so it's really important that, to me, that get repealed in the same way we repealed the prohibition of the sex thing, where someone's ability to marry should be based on their ability to consent and not based on their status, basically. And finally, there's, and I think you heard a little bit about this yesterday from Commissioner Hawes, there's money in the governor's budget to help implement a statewide mental health peer worker certification program, which we are in favor of, and which we want to support in this legislative process. And then finally, what can you do? What can you do to help MadFreedom advance? If you agree with what we're trying to do, is you can take the C-word pledge. You can refrain from conflating mental illness with criminality and violence. You can remember that we're humans. We can be both mentally ill and human at the same time. Also remember that if you met one person with a mental illness, you've only met one person with a mental illness. We're all different. And we can speak for ourselves. And we'd like to be given the opportunity to weigh in on policy and appropriations in this legislature. Thank you for enduring that. There's sources there if you want to check me out. And I'm always available for questions. And I appreciate your attention.
Mari and then Brian.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I really love the app. I can't wait till it's live. And I have been working over the last few years to, I don't use the C word. And when I hear other people using it, I suggest alternatives and explain why it's inappropriate to use that word. So I'm all about the app. I think that's a great idea. I would love to send some virtual jar support to you.
Thank you.
When do you think it'll be live?
Hopefully this year. Yeah. So
But I'll still keep doing it even if the app's not live.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. It's really hard to hear.
Brian?
So you mentioned that since the success of the advocacy of MadFreedom, that no people with mental illness or psychiatric disabilities or conditions have been killed by police.
I hope I didn't say it that way, because the success, it wasn't MadFreedom's advocacy that led to no people being killed. It was the use of force bill, which MadFreedom did support, the training that happened after that, and law enforcement embracing that.
I was kind of summarizing it, and but I think so I appreciate you clarifying. I think the question was that I had was, are you aware of the numbers of how many people were shot but didn't die, or how many people experienced other use of force? Because I know, like in Burlington recently, the police shot a young man who was in crisis and almost killed a bystander, but no one died. And that actually, we viewed that, the people in Burlington that I know at least viewed that as, it was horrible, but we were grateful that the young man wasn't killed, considering the record of our police department. So I'm just curious if you know anything about the numbers of people who've been shot and lived, or who had other use of force. And if you don't know, it's okay, but I was curious.
I know what I've read in the newspaper and what I what I've heard maybe anecdotally. I believe that I'm only aware of 2 incidents in the state, and both of them happened in Burlington, involving people in mental health crisis that ended with some kind of allegation of excessive use of force.
Okay. I think I know both the cases too.
Yeah.
Leslie?
So I know nothing about employment law. And I was curious about your slide on employment discrimination. Are people required to disclose, or I would think that that would not be necessary? I mean, why do you have to disclose that any more than you have to disclose a physical issue?
No, the law is that you don't have to disclose that. The reality is that people who bring, first of all, employment discrimination lawsuits typically settle, except if they're based on a psychiatric disability. they don't settle, they go to court, and juries do not find in favor of people with psychiatric disabilities because of what we've been talking about, just this prejudice and discrimination and oppression of people with psychiatric disabilities.
So does it come out because people require time off and therefore, so I'm just trying to understand the dynamic.
How does it come out that somebody, which scenario?
Well, I'm just thinking about employment discrimination. If employers are reluctant to hire someone with past psychiatric history, how do they know? How do they know about taking psychiatric medication? That seems like it's private.
So the survey asked employers, so you responded to a couple of things, but one of the question about the question to employers were, would you hire someone with a psychiatric history?
Okay.
So they would say, so
it's not like,
right. It was like, no, or we don't want to, or would you hire someone taking a psychotropic medication?
But it's not what's happening in real time. That
it is reflected in our experience.
Okay.
Like I couldn't get hired.
Right. And I'm trying to understand why they even know. I guess that's what I'm stuck on.
For me, you can just Google me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I was at the time I had this manic episode, I was a modest public figure in California, and it was all over the internet. And plus, if you're manic and psychotic, you tend to be grandiose and you attract that kind of attention. So for me, you can just Google me. For others, if you live in a small community, you just know.
Okay. That kind of thing.
And then they find out, I know somebody recently called me up because they were nervous about asking for reasonable accommodations at work because they thought they would be fired because they hadn't disclosed it.
Right.
So that's another.
So that's an ADA. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
But the ADA, it doesn't in practice protect
So that would be an issue. That would be an opportunity or something.
Well, it's not because the law doesn't protect it. It's because when you get to a jury, the jury's just, they don't have the sympathy.
I get it. Okay. Thank you. Laurie?
How about FMLA?
How about
What's
it?
FMLA?
The Federal Family Medical Leave Act that was intended.
I know what it is, but I don't know what your question is.
Yeah, so that part I just said was for the benefit of the community.
We're trying not to use acronyms.
I love that. I hope that goes on your guidelines.
We're trying, right, exactly. We should put that on the guidelines.
So when someone is seeking, I'm going to use the acronym now, FMLA.
Leave, they're looking leave under the FMLA, yes.
Protections for leave related to mental illness are what is the experience of the community trying to apply for FMLA and go through that process? I imagine there's discrimination there too.
Yeah, for those of us who can get jobs. I mean, the problem is we're unemployed. We are disproportionately unemployed. And so, but there are ways to get, if you have a job, and it's particularly one that's covered by FMLA, there are ways to be sophisticated about it so that your employer doesn't even find out why you're taking. As you work with your doctors to make sure the note doesn't say anything revealing. So there are ways around that. The problem with us, we don't have jobs, and the jobs we can get are not covered by FMLA.
Yeah. Well, you have a question?
Oh, just a quick comment about that. It's also important to make sure that our doctors are trained to know how to work with us in that way.
The right language, you mean?
Yes, and comfortable writing that. I know I've had experiences with doctors when applying for federal jobs, which is it A1 status?
I'm not sure.
So there's a certain federal status you can apply for a job, which is, it is a federal protection for people who are of a protected class or have some disability. And we need to make sure that our doctors and nurses and prescribers are aware of what those rules are and feel comfortable writing a note for someone who is being treated for a mental illness or mental health condition. Because some of them, I think, aren't aware that that is a protected class of person. I'm not sure.
Yes, I mean, I just had the experience recently of getting TSA pre-check. And one of the questions on there is, have you ever been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons? And if you answer yes, you can't do TSA pre-check.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wilda. I will say in regards to your priorities, the peer support will be taken up in the next several weeks as part of the budget. So we'll make sure to have you come back in for that testimony.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Definitely. So thank you for your time today, for coming back. We were supposed to have you here last week, and for all you're doing to help change our practices.
Well, thank you for your attention, I appreciate it.
Yeah, so everyone, we'll be back here at 1:00 with continuing with our mental health advocacy days. I'm hearing from some folks.